Let's pick up with our lesson here. On page 392, finishing up from, I'm supposed to start on 393. I wanted to ask if you guys discussed this within the church. This resentment of the new is chronic. Sarah, did you guys discuss change and new things in the church?
No, I just barely got there. Ended up talking about something else, so we did not have a thorough discussion about this. So I'm glad you're picking it up again.
Okay. Well, when I had read it to prepare for myself, I always put little stars and questions to get us all fired up. So what do you think about, we've never done it that way before?
Well, I realize I am of that age group that typically is viewed as being the ones to say that. And I find myself sometimes thinking that, and I have to get myself to slow down, step back, and really evaluate stuff from other people's perspective.
Well, I can't tell you how many times Michael and I have heard since we've been at Bon Air about Cindy being a female minister and the church choosing her 35 years ago. And there are so many female ministers all around the country, and female high school principals and female CEOs in different positions in my lifetime that it's not novel to me.
Not anymore.
35 years ago it was, and there were people who stopped coming to church when she started preaching.
Well, I brought someone to Bon Air that quit coming because of a female minister. And I'm like, did you hear anything she said? Or is it just the fact that she's a woman? And it was simply the fact that she was a woman. The Bible didn't allow for that, and she quit coming. And I'm like, well, I'm so sad because Cindy is absolutely fabulous.
Well, my grandfather questioned me, why are you going to a church with a woman, considering what is said in Romans? And I said, well, Granddaddy, at the time the Bible was written, women were property. They were not educated. They didn't have the opportunities. Today we know better.
Yeah.
And he said,
well,
you've got a good reason, but you'll never catch me inside that building.
Well, and that's fine, and he's entitled to his opinion, but look at the times through history, women literally dressed as men in order to function like men and believed themselves to be called by God.
Right.
During the Middle Ages, it's thought that there was a woman pope.
Yes.
Up and,
have you read that book, Kathy?
Not yet.
I have not either. My list, I tell you, my list is so long. I hope I live long enough to read all the books I want to read.
It's a great book. I've read it. And one of my Lifelong Learning Institute classes, they did a one-day class for just 1 hour on Pope Joan. And right now, the scholars lean toward that it probably didn't happen, but I'm not willing to write it off because what's said in the book, it's written as a historical novel, but the author says, I can't write this as history because there is no documentation, because the Catholic Church, when they figured out what had happened, destroyed every single shred of evidence
that would support it. Right. Well, if you read any of the books out there, were female Revolutionary War soldiers. I finished a book. I read a book last year that I posted on Facebook. It's called My Last Skirt, and it's about an Irish immigrant woman who came living as a man so she could make more money, because she made more money as a man in Ireland. So she just continued the ruse when she immigrated, and they didn't know until she had an accident in her 80s and broke both legs. A wagon backed over her. They didn't know until then she was a woman, and she was getting a Civil War soldier pension, and they took it away from her. So anyway, it's happened a lot through history. Down on page 392, it says, when any living thing stops growing, it starts dying. And in different words, I have always said to friends and relatives, if you're not reading, learning, going to museums, galleries, whatever it is that excites you, where's the stimulus? Where's the excitement and learning in your life? I think you can be 90 years old and learn something new from the Bible. So I agree with that statement right above, about 6 lines up on 392. When any living thing stops growing, it starts dying. Thoughts or comments on that?
I agree. We've talked before about how the church is at a real crossroads. The church universal is at a real crossroads. Just saw last week, less than 50% of Americans now say that they're affiliated with a faith community.
But you know what, Kathy, when it comes time to bury them, all of a sudden they're all connected to a church, even if it's the family church. So I still say people may not go to church, but they have a church affiliation.
Right, have a church affiliation.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not so sure. My sister did not raise her daughters in the church. So they did not raise their children in the church. And those kids are now 30.
Right.
And those kids, so I mean, my sister's great grandchildren, and that counts up to 6 now, they don't know anybody that goes to church.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm not sure there is a family church to them.
Well, it may not be, there isn't for everyone, but you know, I think if God wants people to have a church connection, he'll provide it. So.
Well, I think there are more people that don't have a church connection, don't have that support system for when there are crises in their lives, that kind of thing. So anyhow, so the church is at a real crossroads, and it's our generation that's right now keeping a lot of churches alive.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in the disciples, when I started going to camp 25 years ago this summer, there were 172 churches in Virginia, I think now, and we're down in the upper 120s, lower 130s. And there are churches in the process of closing as we speak. So, I mean, we all know of churches in the Richmond metro area that have closed in our recent history. So, all right, I'll finish from last week with the very right above 392 there. It says, we are living in an age of rapid and tremendous changes. And I think we would agree with that.
Could you mute your audio, because you're doing something in the background.
Who is that, Susan?
Jean, hearing noise back in the background. I think
Jean, I got it for you.
She's muted already.
Yes, I got it. She might be fixing some breakfast.
Yeah.
The very last sentence in that section on 393 says, it is Jesus's warning that the church dare not be the only institution which lives in the past. So I think we need to make reasonable changes to get up with. I mean, God gave us brains to think and make discoveries in technology and medicine and education and whatever. So we have to keep up with those changes. So starting with today, the first section we're going to read today is Matthew 9:18-31, and there's 3 miracle stories in it. This is the healing of Jairus's daughter, the rich ruler's daughter, and Jairus is a Jewish leader, a significant Jewish leader, and he despised Jesus because he was unorthodox. He didn't follow the rules. And he only came to Jesus after he had tried every other remedy he could. So we'll talk about him. Then there's the woman with the issue of blood. I think she'd had it for like 12 years. And anytime you had blood emanating from your body, you were unclean. And anyone who touched you or anything you sat on was unclean. So she might as well have had leprosy. I mean, she was unclean. And really had to limit where she could go and where she could sit and what she could touch and so forth. And she definitely couldn't go to the temple. So that's the woman that touched the fringe of his garment is the second miracle. And the third one is the 2 blind men that came to Jesus. And I don't know if they were Jews or pagans. I don't remember if it says, but they came to him and he healed them, and he told them not to tell anybody, and they were 2 that went and told everybody. So So let's see. They found the point of this section is it doesn't matter how we come to Christ, whether we hate him like Jairus did, or just touch the hem of his garment and just think superstition, oh, if I just touch his clothes, because that's kind of superstitious. She didn't ask him to pray over her or do anything. She just touched his clothes. So it doesn't matter how we come to Jesus, just that we come. And that's what these three examples are supposed to teach us. These three groups of people came from very different circumstances, and he healed all of them. So, all right, on 395, if someone would read the section from Matthew 9.
I've got it.
Thank you.
While he was saying these things, look you, a ruler came and knelt before him in worship. My daughter, he said, has just died, but come and lay your hand upon her and she will live. Jesus rose and went with him, and his disciples came too. And Jesus came to the house of the ruler, and he saw the flute players and the tumult of the crowd. Leave us, he said, for the maid is not dead, she is asleep. And they laughed at him. When the crowd had been put out, he went in and took her hand, and the maid arose. And the report of this went out to the whole country.
All righty. The ruler is Jairus, which in Mark, it mentions him by name. Matthew's account is very brief. The accounts in Mark and Luke are much longer if you'd like to read those, but this is Jairus. He was a ruler of the synagogue, and Barclay tells us he was a very important person. He was elected from among the elders. He was not a teacher. He was not a preacher. He had the care of the public worship. So he supervised the synagogue in general. He appointed the people who did the reading and praying at the service. He invited those who were to preach, and he took care of the synagogue buildings. So I guess the money that was donated, he had the power to spend it for upkeep and maintenance, like a building superintendent and what have you. It's clear that such a man would come to Jesus only as a last resort, because he was very, very powerful himself. He was strictly Orthodox Jew. He regarded Jesus as a dangerous heretic. Only when everything else failed did he turn in desperation to Jesus. Jesus didn't bear a grudge. He knew Jairus couldn't stand him. Here was a man who needed him, and Jesus's one desire was to help. So Jesus went with the ruler of the synagogue to his house, and there were three customs of mourning in the Jewish faith that were taking place at the time that made the whole scene very chaotic. There was rending of garments, and we've heard of that before. People had to rip their clothes. And if you're interested in all the details about the rending of garments, there were dozens of rules about how you could rend your garments, because of course women couldn't do that and expose themselves. So if you're interested, he gives you a whole paragraph on the rules for rending your garment. Very interesting. They created rules for everything. The second thing is there was wailing for the dead. There were professional wailers, and then there were flute players. I've only heard wailing once. The math department chairman at Midlothian High School, Badra Cherubim, he's still the department chair, is from Egypt, a Christian in Egypt, which is less than 10% of the people. And when his wife Miriam died about 15 years ago from bone cancer, we went to the funeral, and it was an Orthodox, like a Greek Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox funeral. So it had the black robes and the guys with the big black hats, and
It's an Orthodox Egypt.
thank you. Yes.
They have a church over here near me.
Yeah. And it was a very different service, first of all. Secondly, there were no professional wailers, because we don't have them here. Badra did it. And all of the teachers and administrators that came from Midlothian were lined up in a pew, and we were like, it was heart-rending. It was horrific. It was loud, and he had a limited amount of time to do it, because then the service began. He was wailing, and it was unbelievable. We all sobbed. It just pulls everything out of you, and you're like, he adored his wife. She was a pharmacist and had bone cancer for years and years and years, and hung on and hung on and hung on. She said, I can't die until Sally is out of elementary school. Sally graduated elementary school, and she died 7 or 9 days later. She had hung on for years. They had amputated her feet. I mean, it was unbelievable, but she hung on until her youngest child finished elementary school. It was unbelievable that she held, and she prayed for God to let her children finish elementary, and he did. But that's the only wailing I've ever heard. And it was, if you've never heard it, it's moving, very moving. The other thing is the flute playing. So you have rending of garments, wailing for the dead, and professional flute players. And I love flute playing, but I can't imagine it would get constantly playing for 7 days would be, I mean, it would cost me I'd have to leave the house. I couldn't listen to that for that period of time. So it says on page 398 that flute playing, and you had to have so many, a minimum, even if you're very, very poor, you had to have at least 2 flutes and 1 wailing woman. There were rules for that too. But on page 398, yes.
There was a maximum number of flutes.
Yes. So on 398, it says that flute playing is so emotionally exciting, and the wailing of the flute. Oh, wait a minute. So emotionally exciting was the wailing of the flute that Roman law limited the number of flute players at any funeral to 10. And I thought, wow. And you were supposed to do these things, the wailing, the flute playing, and the rending of clothes for 7 days, I believe. Wow. Any thoughts, comments?
I'm glad we don't do that.
I am too. The wailing was very disturbing when I heard Badger do it. It was very disturbing. But
Could have been pipers for 7 days.
oh my God. Woo. Well, you couldn't physically hold up your breath that long. I mean, there'd have to be a chain of you to take over, to take breaks.
Gotta stop for a wee dram once in a while.
A wee dram. All right. Then Barclay says Jesus sent all of these people out. So it wasn't a house full of relatives. It was the professional wailers and people rending clothing, and they probably were relatives. And the flute players. So he sent them all out. Let's see. And he said, the girl is not dead. She's only asleep. And all the people laughed at him. And this is very interesting. It says in Greek, as in English, a dead person was often said to be asleep. The word cemetery comes from a Greek word which means a place where people sleep. Isn't that interesting? Now, I know a lot of people believe that you sleep until Jesus returns, and then in Revelation it says he, raises the dead in Christ first. I personally don't believe that. I mean, that might be one option, like for people that died 2 million years ago, but I believe I'm going to heaven the day I die, like Jesus said to the thief on the cross. I don't picture myself, my spirit in a casket. Any thoughts about that? Barclay talks about cataleptic coma. And Barbara, you can tell us what's a cataleptic coma. Do you know?
I'm not sure I know that word cataleptic, but I know a coma, if you're totally unable to move anything, that might be a cataleptic coma. So you
I kind of see epileptic in there a little bit. So I'm thinking it's something where nothing's moving. You can't respond at all. It must be something like that.
Which
I
would
wonder
be
if it's like
deepest
catatonic.
be in.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good point, Kathy. Catatonic. Okay. He calls it cataleptic. He said cataleptic comas were by no means uncommon. Burial in the Middle East follows death very quickly because the climate makes that necessary. And they put spices on the body, but they didn't embalm like we do today. And Barclay says, not infrequently, people were buried alive, and they know that from tombs they've opened and seen claw marks inside. Isn't that horrible?
Well, if George Washington, that happened through the 1700s. And George Washington was so concerned about being buried alive, he asked them to leave him in state an extra few days to make sure he was dead, because he had a tremendous fear of that. So it wasn't just 2,000 years ago that people were being buried alive. Anyway.
Right, and wasn't it a practice at one point, I think in England, that they put a bell in your casket that rang up top, and somebody sat next to your graveside for several days. So if you did come to, you could pull, that's where Saved by the Bell comes from.
Yeah.
That would not be a good thing.
I think burial at sea in the sailing ship days, when they stitched you up in a bag, the last stitch was through your nose.
Oh,
Make sure you were dead.
Wow,
God,
I've
don't tell
never
me
heard
that.
that. Wow, we're just a wealth of knowledge, aren't we, guys?
How morbid.
Yeah, but we all read different stuff, different resources. It says Jesus that day in Capernaum rescued a young Jewish girl from the grasp of death. And it may have been that Jesus knew she was in that cataleptic coma. She might not have really been dead. She might have just been sleeping. Either way, he raised her. Do what? Oh, Michael looked it up for me. A trance-like state marked by loss of voluntary motion in which the limbs remain in whatever position they are placed.
so you don't move.
Yeah, so it's like catatonic, I guess. Okay, on page 399, the woman who had the hemorrhage, if someone would read that section.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Before I do, I don't know if the rest of you noticed that Barclay in his translations in these passages puts "look you."
It's everywhere.
Yeah, and I've looked at the other translations and I can't figure out, there's nothing in other translations that draws that. It's like to get your attention. So anyhow, and look you, a woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind him and touched the tassel of his cloak. For she said to herself, if I only touch his cloak, I will be cured. Jesus turned and saw her. Courage, daughter, he said. Your faith has brought you healing. And the woman was cured from that hour.
Barclay says, from the Jewish point of view, this woman could not have suffered from any more terrible or humiliating disease than an issue of blood. It was a trouble which was very common in Palestine, and the Talmud sets out no fewer than 11 different cures for it, which we assume this lady had probably paid tons of money to doctors, soothsayers, charlatans. She probably had done everything she could to stop this problem because, like leprosy, it made her unclean. When Mark tells this story, he makes it clear that this woman had tried everything else first. And the whole blood flow makes her unclean. She can't touch anybody, go into other people's homes, go to temple. She can't do anything. She was absolutely shut off from the worship of God, the fellowship of other men and women. There's little wonder she was desperately eager to try anything which might rescue her from her life of isolation and humiliation. And then Barclay, like he does, gives us a 2-paragraph history of tassels. I had no idea. There was so much. And I Googled a picture of the modern prayer cloth. And if you go down to the 4 tassels on the corners of the prayer cloth, you can see the number of beads, the twisted fibers. They literally have rules about those tassels. The fringes were 4 tassels of blue worn by a Jew on the corners of the outer garment, which current Jews wear on their prayer shawl, which they put over their shoulders when they pray. Let's see. Jesus, as soon as she touched him, Jesus halted, and for the moment for him, no one but that woman and nothing but her need existed. And I think it's phenomenal that with all the crowd pressing around him, he knew that she touched his fringe and that power left his body. She needed him to heal her. And Barclay makes a point of saying, for Jesus, no one is ever lost in the crowd. He knows everything about everybody and what our needs are at all times. And I absolutely believe that. But the world is not like that. The world is able to divide people into those who are important and those who are not. And Barclay gives an example of that. And we've all read things in the paper about big events, and all they talk about is some rich or famous person that died, not the other people who died. And he gives an example of a man who wrote a detailed story about the Titanic sinking in April of 1912. And I guess most of us that have read any of that stuff know that John Jacob Astor, a very wealthy man, was on the ship. And all this man in his account talked about was John Jacob Astor. And he says it was mentioned that 1,800 other people were also lost. The only one who really mattered, the only one with real news value, was the millionaire. The other losses were of no real importance. So I guess the point is, Jesus is not like that writer. To Jesus, all of us are important, regardless of our station or position in life. And Jesus knew immediately that she had touched him. And Barclay says, this is something to remember in a day and an age when the individual is in danger of getting lost. Men and women tend to become numbers in a system. We're losing our right to be an individual. But God and Jesus, to God and Jesus, we are never like that. We are always individuals, and God created us that way.
And think about when Barclay was writing, you know,
I looked that up, Harold.
45 to 55, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
56.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, what would he say about today if he thought it was
Yeah.
bad then, you know?
Yeah, we're way beyond where they were in 56. Yeah. Yeah, conformity seems to be much more moving along at a much rapid clip now than it was in 56. To me, maybe not. Any thoughts or comments about that? He healed the woman. I mean, well, she was healed as soon as she touched his garment.
I'm just glad that I believe it to be true. Do you know what I mean? That he does see us individually, because there are very few people or institutions in this world that recognize the value of every individual.
Claire, I'm going to tell you something that's probably y'all may think is very bizarre. I believe when God creates us, he puts a little bit of himself, our soul, our spirit, your conscience, whatever you want to call it, in each of us. And I believe every living person has a piece of that. Hitler, Stalin, everybody. Whether you choose to act on it or not and be a good person is one thing. But I believe there's a piece of God in everyone that he loves, the piece of him, but everybody doesn't choose to reap the benefits from that, I guess, is the best way to say that. And some people die never having, you know, living a horrible life, doing horrible things to other people, maybe drug addiction, alcohol, abuse, whatever, and they just never realize the potential from that little piece of God that he put inside when he created them.
The kingdom of God is within you.
Yeah, yeah. And some people, you know, and I've even thought about, I sit around and think way too much. I've often thought about, what if God puts that in you and you don't use what he gave you, and he makes you come back and do a do-over? What if he makes them come back And maybe Stalin and Hitler came back in Calcutta, India. You know, you really messed up. I gave you a position of power and authority and you messed up. Now you go over here and, you know, you can be a, what do they call the lowest caste in India?
Untouchables.
Yeah, maybe you can go back and do a do-over because you didn't use well what I gave you. I mean, I've thought about that. I wonder, because so many people say, I feel like I've been here before.
You have to be Clarence the angel.
Clarence the angel.
Yeah, to help somebody
You
else.
got to help somebody else to elevate your position. Any thoughts about that or that line of thinking?
Well, Kitten, I think what you're describing, because I agree with you, is, you know, it says we're made in God's image, that's the part of God, that's another way of saying what you just said.
Yeah. I think about things and I say some of this stuff in fellowship sometimes, and Tim and Frank will look at me sometimes and say, why are you teaching this class? It's like, you shouldn't be in here.
You should be down the hall with us, yeah.
Yeah, well, and I'm okay with that. They're certainly entitled to express their opinion, but Tim grew up very Baptist, and you know, you're really not supposed to question things in the Bible. You just believe on faith and don't think about it and worry about it. But I love to have conversations with people about things in the Bible and what you think and what you believe. And I have a cousin who's an engineer in Virginia Beach that's about 10 years older than me. And when we get together at family reunions, we have a good time discussing.
Kitten actually experienced doing nothing past week, because this place didn't have a TV. It had Wi-Fi, but it did not have a TV. And so several evenings she would just sit on the porch and listen to nature. And she finally got it. She's like, is this doing nothing?
I've never done that ever.
And she enjoyed it.
Oh my gosh.
I do not ever sit and do nothing. If I sit, I've got a book in my hand. I'm checking Facebook. I'm writing emails. I never sit and literally do nothing.
But you liked it, right?
I did like it.
Good for you.
Kitten, we are not human doings, we are human beings.
Right.
I've read that lots of times.
Yeah, I'm glad you
Good.
finally figured it out.
It's just all around. You know, we talk about the kingdom of God being in us and all, you know, the good things. And sometimes I worry that we focus way too much on our religious practice about all the good things that are going to happen when we die. And we're going to go to heaven, you know, and on a good day, heaven's right here in my backyard.
I agree with that.
And I take it one step further, Kitten, to believing that God is within us, God is within everything. That you see nature, you see the rocks and the everything, you know, God is within everything.
I agree.
It's not just a little piece, it's every little hair on your head that is a part, because every atom or whatever atoms are made up of, you know.
Yeah, I think Susan, I absolutely agree with you. I think the older I get, the easier it is for me to understand. I believe a lot more than I did when I was younger. I was so busy when I was younger, being married and raising kids and going to work. And now that I'm retired, I can sit and think and read stuff that makes me think more. And I really, really enjoy that.
But you still ask a lot of questions.
I do ask a lot of questions.
They had a mile-long driveway, and we walked it usually twice a day. And, you know, she'd see a flower out in the middle of the field. Like, wonder why that is there. Wonder who put that there.
Yeah.
For you to enjoy. I mean,
Somebody planted it.
One of our
I
older
heard a
friends
saying one time that said, we are in God the way fish are in water.
That's
Ooh,
good.
I like that. Bud, you said?
Well, Susan's basically second dad, our friend Chauncey Love. He and another guy were sitting out in the backyard once, and the phone rang, and they picked it up and said, "We're busy. We're watching a bird build a nest," and they hung up.
Wow.
But
Well,
that's cool, though. I mean,
yeah. Well, I watched two Phoebes all week, just sit on the little branch and bob their tails. They never called all week, but they were looking for where to build their nest. So when we go back in August, I'm gonna find it.
Yep. We pulled over and watched an eagle on the side of the road.
We did. Yep, there was an eagle. We slammed on brakes and pulled over, eating a dead deer. So we watched the eagle eat a dead deer. Yeah. it's
You know,
pretty
that,
cool.
that's an indication, Kitten, that he's relatively young because it takes eagles a while to figure out how to fish.
He was mature though. His head was white.
Yeah, he was white. Yeah, but he probably was not 10 years old. Yeah.
Yeah. And while we're talking about birds, let me just throw in that 5 minutes ago, we just saw our first hummingbird outside.
Yay! I've put my feeder up. Yay!
Yeah.
All right, let's continue on page 403. If someone would read the section about the two blind men.
I'll read that.
Thanks, Susan.
And as he passed on from there, two blind men followed him, shouting, "Have pity on us," they said, "you son of David." When he came into the house, the blind men came to him. Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" "Yes, Lord," they said. Then he touched their eyes. "Be it to you," he said, "according to your faith." And their eyes were opened. And Jesus sternly commanded them, "See, let no one know of this." But they went out and spread abroad the story of him all over the country.
I tell you, reading Barclay is like, it's better than reading a novel. He adds so much of the history and the culture that makes you understand the verses so much better. I did not know, Barclay says, blindness was a distressingly common disease in Palestine because of the glare from the sun on protected eyes and clouds of unclean flies that carried infections, which led to loss of sight. And that just sounds horrific. People that referred to Jesus as the son of David, because David was the greatest warrior ever in Jewish history. People who refer to Jesus as son of David are thinking of him coming back as a military leader, which some people think that's what Judas thought too. Judas thought he was forcing Jesus's hand to do the military overthrow of Rome. And when he realized he was wrong, of course, he took the money back and hung himself. But he's called son of David in here because these two blind fellas were thinking he was going to be the next military ruler. Almost always used by crowds or by people who knew Jesus at a distance, they would call him son of David. So these were not people in his close traveling group. These were people who knew him like in the crowd. Let's see, they expected him to be the Messiah, the promised deliverer of David's line, and restore their freedom from Rome. These two blind men came to Jesus with a very inadequate idea of who he was and what he was, and yet he helped them anyway. And then Barclay gives us 3 ways in which Jesus dealt with them. First of all, he did not answer their shouts at once outside. He made them come in and find him personally so he could talk to them one-on-one and say, "Do you believe that I can do this?" So he didn't want to yell at them in a crowd. He made them come seek him out. There are people in actual fact, Barclay says, who do not wish their chains to be broken. There are many people who, if they were honest, would have to say that they do not wish to lose their sin or stop sinning. Like if you're drinking too much or eating too much or whatever, and you figure you're not hurting anyone but yourself. I can see some people doing that. I don't know that I know a person specifically that understands their sinning and is purposely continuing to do it. But Barclay does give a paragraph discussion here about some people do not want to stop their sin. And these two men wanted to be healed of their blindness. Barclay also says, number 2, it is interesting to note that Jesus, in effect, compels these people to come find him alone. And then third, he asked these men only one question. Do you believe that I am able to do this? So he was checking their level of faith. And there are some people that despite anything that happens to them, they remain super positive, have great faith. When I read this last night, Tracy Eagle immediately popped into my mind. All she has been through over years and years and years of cancer struggle and treatment, still super positive, great faith. And all of us, I'm sure, know other people like that.
Well, Harriet Griggs.
Yeah. Well, and Peg McFadden too. Peg struggled and still came to church with gloves and a mask on. I mean, risking getting sick, but she still came.
Yeah.
You
know, something about this passage and others like it that has always kind of puzzled me is when Jesus heals somebody and says, don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
You don't have to tell people. If I'm blind and all of a sudden I can see, Tom's going to notice.
You would think, yeah. Yeah.
I've talked about it before, but I can't remember what the conclusion was about why Jesus says that.
But I think he meant, because I know a lot of us will help somebody and then just forget it. I mean, I'll do something for somebody and months down the road, Kit and I'll be talking and she goes, you don't ever do anything. And then I'll bring them up. And so, I mean,
just throw me under the bus with
don't need to tell anybody what you're doing. God knows.
I have read that it's about timing, that it wasn't his time yet to be recognized with the overall time that he understood for things to take place. I've read that. I don't know.
Yeah, I understand Jesus not wanting the recognition. It just seems like a funny thing to say because, you heal somebody of leprosy, it's noticeable. So, but I do understand what you mean, Harold. I agree with that.
Yeah, I do too. Timing. Yeah.
Yeah, one of my Bibles translated that part. They talked it, but so he tells them not to tell anyone, but when they had gone away, they talked about him all over the countryside.
Wow.
Susan? Yes. Does anyone remember a place in the scripture where Jesus no longer tells them not to tell anyone?
Because the four gospels parallel each other, I'm not sure.
When he heals the, 9 lepers or something, and he says, go show yourselves to the priests, and
that's pretty early,
that was a couple weeks ago.
But I thought perhaps this was the only time he said, don't tell anybody. Are there other instances?
Yeah, there are others.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you might make too much out of it. It might be like Michael talking about doing something and not saying anything, because sometimes we all do something for someone and they thank us a lot and you say, oh, don't mention it.
Well, and
don't worry about it,
And when we
it might have been in that more casual context and we're making too much out
and
of it.
remember when we were studying, helping people and the Jewish tradition at the temple, you're supposed to help people and not really let that person know who helped them. You weren't supposed to take that credit. You were supposed to help people, out of just your desire, to help people and not want any credit.
All right, guys, I have 9:49.
Getting warmed up.
Well, I'm afraid if we try to do another section, we're going to get into big discussion.
They ask us to stop about 10 till so that everyone can get in at church and one time we got a telephone call from Cindy to tell us we needed to stop.
Well, that's because I was an elder.
Oh, okay.
Well, I think we do need to do a better job of stopping a little bit earlier. So let's try to shoot for 9:50. So Kathy, if you'll pick up on page 405, I guess next week.
Right.
Thank you guys for the great discussion and for coming to Sunday school.
Thank you.